In the spring of 2013, on a cold, quiet night in the English countryside, two officers received what appeared to be just another call. A building alarm going off. Possibly a break-in. Routine. But this story was anything but. What happened that night outside a strange facility, known as Crosswade Enterprises, would alter the way those officers saw the world. And themselves. They were sent to investigate a disturbance. But what they uncovered felt like a tear in reality itself. A moment when the rules broke. When cause and effect slipped. And they came face to face not with danger, but with a version of the impossible. This is the story of the Crosswade Interlopers. And if you think you've heard it all before, think again. The call came in just after 2 a.m. on March 31st, 2013. James Haviland sat in the passenger seat of the patrol car, staring out at the darkness that lined the narrow countryside roads near Whitehaven, Cumbria. His partner, Chris Braddock, was driving. Both were seasoned officers. Both were calm. And both were unprepared for what was about to unfold. The message from the CCR, Contacts and Control Room, was clear. A possible break-in had been detected at a remote smart building owned by Crosswade Enterprises. It was a highly advanced facility, isolated in the middle of nowhere, and as far as either officer knew, it wasn't the kind of place that needed on-site security. No guards, no staff, just an eerie, ultra-modern structure surrounded by miles of fields and woods. 3 miles out, empty roads, no headlights in sight. James considered flicking on the siren. But what was the point? They were already ghosts on the move, passing through a world that slept while something strange stirred ahead. The Crosswade facility had always stood out, its architecture jarringly modern in an otherwise rustic part of Cumbria. Glass, metal, automated systems. It felt like a tech hub dropped into a field of sheep and fog. And according to the building's remote sensors, something, or someone, was inside. The building systems had reported heat signatures. Alarms had gone off intermittently. Lights flickered, all of it seen from afar by the facility's manager, who was miles away but had access to every camera, every circuit, every warning light. But when Chris and James pulled up across the road, there was nothing. No movement, no lights, no break-ins, nothing but a building sitting too quietly in its own silence. That was the first warning sign. Sometimes, nothing is more suspicious than a total lack of wrong. They sat in the car, waiting, watching, not eager to step into a place that felt so utterly still. Even the wind that rustled around the car sounded muted, like the world around them had turned down its own volume. James thought he saw a flicker of light in one of the ground floor windows. Maybe a smoke detector, maybe his imagination. He blinked it away. They were here to check a system malfunction. That's what they told themselves. But something wasn't right, and they both knew it. There's a difference between silence and stillness. Silence can be comforting. Stillness, however, true, perfect stillness, can set off something primal in the brain. It feels wrong, unnatural. That's exactly what James and Chris felt as they stared at the Crosswade building from the safety of their patrol car. On paper, Crosswade Enterprises sounded like just another tech firm. But in reality, it was something else entirely. A smart building, as the industry called it. Self-monitoring, fully automated, filled with technology that didn't belong out here, among farmland and fog. It had heat sensors, lighting automation, AI-powered access systems. The kind of infrastructure you'd expect in a Silicon Valley campus. Not in rural Cumbria. The building didn't belong here. Not just architecturally, but emotionally. It gave off a kind of resistance, as if the earth itself hadn't wanted it. Like it had been dropped from above, imposed upon the landscape. Even from the outside, it was wrong. James checked his watch. 2:21 a.m. Across the road, the building sat in darkness. No signs of entry. No motion. No malfunction. No life. The officers were trained to look for signs of intrusion, for broken locks, shattered glass. But what do you do when everything is intact, yet something still feels like a threat? Chris leaned forward, adjusting his rear-view mirror instinctively, as though he might spot something behind them. James, meanwhile, kept his eyes on the entrance. The longer they stared, the more the building seemed to take on a kind of presence. Not just a structure, but an entity, like it was aware of them, watching them back. Suddenly, a flicker, a flash from inside. One of the lobby lights sparked to life, then shut off just as fast. James blinked. Chris asked if he saw it too. He had. A light like that doesn't turn on for no reason. Not in a building designed to only respond to presence. They radioed back to CCR. Still the only unit in the area. Still no new intel. And then it happened again. Another light. This one didn't shut off. The automatic doors opened with a hiss and a low mechanical groan. No one stepped out. No one could be seen. The lobby, bathed in pale fluorescence, stood empty. Then the alarm. An ear-piercing screech, electronic and shrill, sliced through the quiet. Chris and James jumped. It was logical to assume a system glitch. Faulty sensors. Maybe power surges. But the way the building behaved, it wasn't random. It was choreographed. The kind of movements you'd expect from something alive, not programmed. And then silhouettes. Two figures emerged from the lobby. Tall, broad, wearing caps, vests. Not intruders. Police uniforms. Just like theirs. The first figure turned and jogged to the right. The second, taller, headed left. Not toward the car. Not toward them. Chris reached for the radio. James scanned the road for another patrol unit. There was nothing. CCR confirmed again. No other police on site. So who were these two? They had uniforms. They had movement patterns. They even had the posture. And they were familiar. Uncomfortably so. In normal circumstances, this would be the part where officers jump out of their vehicle and pursue suspects on foot. Training would take over. Instincts would kick in. But that didn't happen. Chris and James didn't move. They just stared. The two figures that had emerged from the Crosswade lobby weren't behaving like suspects. They weren't dressed like intruders. They weren't sneaking or running wildly. No, they walked with purpose, familiarity, and something about their posture, the bulk of their vests, the shape of their caps. It all felt too close, too right, too much like them. Chris scanned the area again, looking for another police vehicle. Nothing, not even headlights in the distance. Meanwhile, James radioed dispatch. His voice was calm, but laced with confusion. Were there any other units dispatched to the site? Any plainclothes officers? Any private security involved? Negative. CCR confirmed. No other units in the vicinity. They were alone. So who were the two men who had just walked out of the building? And why did they look like they belonged in the same uniforms as James and Chris? Maybe they were private security guards. Maybe. But that didn't explain how they moved. There's a kind of rhythm in how officers walk. A balance of caution and readiness. Chris saw it in the way the taller figure moved. James recognized it in the way the shorter one had jogged. Like someone trained to move through danger, but not afraid of it. Then something even stranger happened. The two unknown figures returned. They came back around the corners of the building from opposite sides, just as calmly as they had left. This time, they didn't re-enter the building. They just stood there, right outside the main entrance, looking around, confused. The taller one, broad-shouldered, with a stiff gait, nudged a small stone with his foot. Just an idle kick. A reflex. Something that would seem meaningless to anyone else. But James's eyes widened. Chris's posture stiffened. It was a movement they both recognized. The way he kicked the stone. It was the exact way Chris did it. Absent-minded. Only when he was thinking hard. That's when they both realized it. They weren't just looking at other officers. They were looking at themselves. The figures glanced toward the police car, and then they began to run. Straight toward it. Chris and James leapt out of their vehicle, ready to confront them. But the parking lot was empty. The two figures had vanished. No running footsteps. No door slams. No sounds at all. Just empty air and the Crosswade building, standing silently behind them. Chris turned in circles, scanning every possible exit. James stepped away from the car, checking behind shrubs and around the building. Nothing. They were in a wide open space. No one could have disappeared that quickly. And still, the strangest part, the world had gone silent. No rustling leaves. No wind. No hum of far-off engines. Just an eerie, complete stillness that felt like a vacuum. They looked at each other. One thought, shared wordlessly between them. We just saw ourselves. Time didn't stop. It simply changed. That's the best way James could later describe it. After the shock of seeing their apparent duplicates vanish, Chris and James stood motionless, as if afraid that moving might somehow make the memory disappear. Or worse, confirm it was real. But training has a way of pulling even the most shaken officers back into their roles. After a long, disbelieving silence, James muttered the only words that made any kind of sense in that moment. "We need to check the building." Chris didn't argue. He never did in moments like this. Instead, the two men crossed the road and approached the Crosswade facility, boots crunching softly on gravel. The front doors, which had previously opened and shut on their own, were now locked tight. They called the facility's manager and requested access. The man on the other end of the line sounded groggy, confused, and skeptical, but eventually agreed to remotely unlock the entrance. The doors hissed open again, and the stale air of the dark lobby greeted them like a held breath finally exhaled. James remained on the ground floor, flashlight in hand, while Chris moved upstairs to sweep the first floor. The building felt colder now, not in temperature, but in spirit. There's something unnatural about high-tech silence. The walls didn't creak. The air didn't hum. There was no sound except their own footsteps and the occasional click of a door handle. James passed through a line of empty offices. Chairs, desks, monitors. Everything perfectly arranged, but lifeless. He paused at a glass wall that overlooked the lobby and watched the security lights blink red in slow, steady pulses, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. Then the light flickered. Again. And the doors opened. Again. The alarm shrieked through the building, shattering the thick silence like glass underfoot. James ran back toward the lobby, expecting to catch someone mid-escape, but the space was empty. His mind screamed, "They've slipped past us." He bolted outside, scanning the parking lot. Nothing. Not a single soul. Instinct told him to head left, toward the rear of the building. He sprinted into the service area and found a narrow alley lined with bins and a tall brick wall. He checked every corner, every container. He even tried to climb the wall himself, but it was too high. No one could have escaped that way. Chris appeared from the opposite direction, eyes wide and breathing hard. He hadn't seen anyone either. Together, they returned to the front of the building. And for the second time that night, they stood in the same spot, baffled. They should have seen someone. They should have heard something. But the only thing around them was the quiet hiss of the wind returning, as if the world had finally hit unpause. Chris kicked a pebble in frustration, and that was when the realization hit like ice in the lungs. It was the pebble, the same one the figure had kicked earlier. They turned toward their vehicle. Inside, lit faintly by the dashboard, were two faces staring out at them. Their own. It's one thing to see something strange. It's another to see something you know is impossible and recognize your own face in it. James didn't move. Chris didn't breathe. For a few eternal seconds, they simply stared at the figures inside the car. Not just similar figures, not just uniforms that matched, but faces, expressions, posture. The two officers in the car weren't shadows. They weren't hallucinations. The dashboard lights reflected off their skin. One had his arm resting exactly where Chris always put his. The other was leaning forward, just like James did when trying to read distant plates at night. Every detail was precise. Every detail was them. Chris blinked. James stepped forward, then back. The air felt thick, as if time had turned to syrup around them. But reality didn't correct itself. No glitch snapped back into place. No dream dissolved. The figures remained. And then they didn't. The doors opened. No one stepped out. No movement. No sound. And then silence. True silence. A kind of absence so deep it made their own breath sound like sirens. They ran. Of course they ran. Back to the car. Across the gravel. Gravel that no longer crunched. Wind that no longer blew. And when they reached the patrol car, they found what they'd feared. Nothing. No one inside. No warm seats. No lingering breath on the windshield. No signs that anyone had been there, except themselves. Chris opened the passenger door and just stood there, staring at the dashboard. James circled the car slowly, as if trying to catch some detail they'd missed. But the patrol car was just that, a car. One they'd driven here. One that had, up until moments ago, only ever belonged to them. Except now, it felt like it didn't. James opened his mouth, then shut it. Chris rubbed his eyes. Neither one spoke. They had just watched a version of themselves vanish. And there was nothing in the training manual for this. Was it a glitch in time? A hallucination shared between two people? Were they part of some unknowable loop? Had they glimpsed a future that never happened? Or a present that never should have? James took a step back and looked at the building. It was dark again. Silent. The lights that had flashed. The doors that had opened. All quiet. Like nothing had ever happened. But something had happened, and they were still standing in the center of it. The pebble Chris had kicked was still there, and the memory of the other version of them, locked in the moment it was most real, wasn't going anywhere. Neither man spoke of what they saw in their official report. Because how could they? How do you explain that you saw yourself? And worse, that your other self disappeared before you did? What do you do after seeing something that defies everything you believe about how the world works? If you're a cop, you fall back on what you know. Procedure, investigation, search and report. That's what Chris and James did. Not because they believed it would help, but because it was the only thing they had left. A ritual to ground themselves in the face of madness. After the doppelgangers vanished and the patrol car returned to normal, whatever normal even meant now, they re-entered the Crosswade building. Their movements were sharper this time, less cautious, more desperate. They weren't just searching for intruders anymore. They were searching for evidence that they hadn't lost their minds. Inside, everything remained as before. Offices empty, corridors cold. The building's automated systems didn't acknowledge their presence. Lights flickered on only when they passed. A smart building that suddenly seemed too smart and eerily indifferent. James moved floor to floor, clearing rooms, opening drawers. Nothing. No signs of forced entry. No evidence of tampering. No explanation. Chris returned to the lobby and paced. That's when it happened again. The doors. A flicker. A hiss. The mechanical sound of the entrance opening, though no one approached. And then the alarm. The shriek came back. tearing through the air like a scream with no mouth. James came running from the stairwell. Chris was already at the door, searching for anyone fleeing. Again, nothing. But James didn't hesitate this time. He sprinted toward the left side of the building, rounding the corner into the rear area. It was a refuse zone. Walls high, bins stacked, the kind of place an intruder might try to hide. But there was no one there. No movement. No breath. Just a quiet too complete to trust. He checked the bins. Inside. Behind. Under. Still nothing. He even tried to scale the wall, convinced there must be an exit somewhere. But it was too high. Impenetrable. He stood for a moment, hand on the bricks, and felt the cold seep into his skin. No one escaped this way. Back at the front, Chris had done the same in reverse, checking the right flank. They met once more by the entrance, their expressions haunted. They didn't need to say it. Again, the pattern. Lights, doors, alarm. But no intruder. No movement. Just the overwhelming sense that they were being led in circles by the building, or by something inside it. And then Chris, without thinking, kicked a pebble. It bounced once, twice, and settled. James turned his head slowly. He'd seen this before. Exactly this. And it struck him then, not as a realization, but as a confirmation. They weren't just reacting to a disturbance. They were inside of one. A loop. A layer. A moment replaying itself. Or worse, echoing something that hadn't happened yet. Whatever was happening, it no longer felt like something they were experiencing. It felt like something they were inside of. A mechanism. A maze. A performance. And they weren't the audience. Chris and James found themselves standing once again in front of their patrol car, caught between fear and a failing need for logic. James opened the driver's door and sat down, almost in defiance. The seat was cold, empty, but real. The dashboard lit up just as it should. Everything looked the same, except he didn't feel the same. He looked into the rearview mirror and saw Chris pacing outside. He looked again and saw himself. Not a reflection, not a trick of the light. Just him, sitting in the same spot, blinking at the same speed, holding the same tension in his jaw. But it wasn't his reflection. It was someone else wearing his skin, mirroring every twitch, every breath. Outside, Chris caught something out of the corner of his eye. Movement. In one of the darkened windows of the Crosswade facility. Someone was watching. He stepped forward, shielding his eyes from the faint glow of the car's headlights. And what he saw nearly dropped him to his knees. Two silhouettes, standing in the second-story office. Unmoving, one leaned just slightly, mimicking his own posture. The other mirrored James' slump in the seat. It wasn't surveillance. It was reflection, echo, imitation. Except they were inside the building, watching the original versions repeat a loop they hadn't agreed to. James stepped out of the car slowly, his face pale. He and Chris stared up at the glass. But now, there was nothing. The silhouettes were gone. The hallway behind the glass darkened once again. They didn't speak. What could be said? Chris walked around the car. James followed. They circled it like an animal testing a trap. When they passed in front of the vehicle, both looked through the windshield, on instinct, and saw it again. Two versions of themselves, sitting calmly in the patrol car. But this time, the figures turned their heads to look at them, not in surprise. In recognition, James staggered back. Chris drew his flashlight and aimed it at the windshield, but the light passed through, illuminating empty seats. Gone. Again. But not forgotten. Chris let the flashlight fall to his side. James looked down at the gravel, hoping for a distraction. Anything. A print. A clue. But there was nothing to explain what they'd seen, except the growing, oppressive sense that they were not the observers in this story. They were the ones being watched. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, sleepless nights, and avoidance. Chris and James didn't talk much about what had happened. Not to each other, not to their supervisors, not even to themselves. They filed the report like they were supposed to. False alarm. Technical malfunction. No suspects on site. But between the lines of those tidy phrases, a heavy silence clung to every word. James, who'd never believed in anything he couldn't explain, found himself drawn to late-night forums, reading accounts he used to laugh at. Doppelganger sightings, time slips, shared delusions, simulation theory. None of it comforted him, because none of it could fully explain what he had seen. And who? Chris was quieter than usual, his once easy banter reduced to nods and half-smiles. At night, he would sometimes sit in his car in his driveway long after his shift had ended, staring into his own windshield, wondering if someone else was staring back. They each carried it differently, but neither escaped it. A single moment had rewritten the laws they lived by. One night, weeks later, James returned to the Crosswade facility. Alone. No call-out. No report. Just the need to know. But the building stood silent, cold, as if the thing they'd seen had already moved on. He walked around the perimeter, flashlight in hand, searching not for evidence, but for context, for validation that it wasn't a shared madness, that something real had happened. He found nothing. Of course he did. Later, at home, he reopened the file again, the photos they'd taken, the timestamps, the security logs, and something began to eat at him. The system showed 2 pings, thermal movement signatures, each exactly 2.4 minutes apart. That wasn't abnormal, but when he ran the time of their own car's GPS arrival, it didn't align. They were already on site when the first ping happened, but they hadn't seen anyone enter. Because maybe, no one had to, maybe the system wasn't detecting intruders. Maybe it was detecting them. Twice, from 2 points in time. Chris refused to go back. He'd made peace with it, or locked it away somewhere he didn't intend to revisit. James couldn't. He kept seeing flashes of the figures behind the windshield. Sometimes in reflections, in elevator doors, in rear-view mirrors. Not constant, not even consistent, just possible. He stopped telling people what he'd seen. The more he explained, the less it sounded real. And still, on quiet nights, he'd ask himself the question he feared most. What if they were never the originals? What if they were the echoes? Some stories end with answers, some with closure. But the Crosswade interlopers? That story didn't end at all. The facility still stands. Alone, out in the fog-draped stretches of Cumbria, its lights blink obediently when called. Its doors respond to commands. Its systems log everything. But if you ask the local officers, off the record, they'll tell you something changed after that night. A silence deeper than silence. A kind of unease that hums below the surface. James eventually left the force. Not in disgrace, not with a bang, just quietly, like someone trying to slip out of a loop. Chris stayed, but he never returned to that building. The Crosswade incident became an agreed silence between them. Something you don't bring up, not unless you want to feel it breathing again. And maybe that's the real horror of it all. Not that something happened, but that it could happen again. That somewhere, under the surface of what we call real, there are echoes, patterns, versions of ourselves walking the same beats, driving the same roads, making choices we haven't made yet. And sometimes, if the conditions are just right, the loop slips. And for a few awful minutes, you see them. And worse, they see you. So if you're ever out in the countryside late at night, and you pass a strange building that doesn't belong, maybe keep driving. If you stop, and the lights flicker on when no one's inside, maybe don't go closer. And if you see yourself staring back from behind glass, run! Or don't! Maybe it was always going to happen anyway. Thanks for watching. If you've experienced anything like this, or have a theory on what really happened that night, leave a comment below. And remember, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones where you're in it twice.